We landed on the estate of Klaus Freiherr or Freeman, Count von Schlieffen, in Drölitz, Kreis Güstrow, near Lage, at midnight. We were put in a stable of a large tick-infested piggery for the night. In the morning a gendarme came by to question all of these undesirable-looking refugees who were occupying the pig pens. Lucky for us that the policeman found out that I attended the very same college and classes as Rudolf von Tatten-Triglav, a former member of the Polish exiled royal household. We were summoned to the Schloss or mansion of the estate to report to the whereabouts of the von Tattens. The forester's house was emptied of its occupants and we became the new occupant. We thought that we were finally safe in this location, but the Russian troops had slashed through the middle of Germany by late spring of 1945 by passing the northern coastal line, and on the 7th of May 1945 we watched German horse-drawn artillery howitzers driving hurriedly cross-country through the grain fields for their new positions. Then we saw next a long line of Russian 64-ton Stalin tanks with their long-barrel 122mm cannons driving down the highway leading to a large fenced-off, once secret V-weapons rocket arsenal. There was more realism and action to it than a Rambo or Schwarzenegger movie could offer. We stood at the top of an anti-tank ditch approximately 1 kilometer from the highway, watching the spectacle unfold as all of a sudden a huge cloud arose to the altitude the same as a high-flying bomber. To our surprise, the ensuing shockwave knocked us backwards into the anti-tank ditch. The Germans had blown the whole V-weapons depot into the air, giving us and the nearby Russian tank crew a severe headache. The ensuing evening brought with it plunder and drinking and mass rape of the German women and girls by the Russian conquerors. It started on one end of the village and proceeded from house to house like a locust infestation. When hearing the crying and sobbing of women, my mother, sister, brother and I slipped out of the rear window of the house before these rapists were able to unlock the front door. We quietly and quickly left our abode at night and slept in the forest. I remember one night, as we were under our blankets, a wild mother pig with her piglings running through our little hideaway in the forest. These were real unscheduled Boy Scout outings. We were listening to the spirit. Many of those who had only one option of escape left, namely last-minute evacuation by ship, drowned in the frigid waters of the wintry Baltic Sea off the coast of eastern Pomerania, after being torpedoed by Russian submarines. Strenuous escape from the Russians during the winter seemed almost for nothing. My family and I had pulled the handcarts through the deep snow, 30 to 35 below zero, with our meager belongings while fleeing from the advancing Russian front. We marched on foot through 2.5 provinces, while being sometimes under artillery fire and aircraft attack, only to be eventually overtaken by the Russians. Out of necessity, we would sleep in ditches beside the roads, for houses were burned out and in ruins. They had no window panes and no heat nor roofs. We pushed away some snow, put our raincoats on the ground, covered it with a blanket and 2 feather bag type comforters, then another blanket, 2 more raincoats and a pile of snow. The 4 of us, my mother, brother Klaus, and my sister Ilse and I, sandwiched ourselves between the featherbags or comforters many a night, while the artillery barrage could be heard overhead. This is how we survived the winter. Many refugees simply froze to death. I'm glad that my mother made sure that we loaded our featherbags and raincoats onto the handcart. The former were part of our handmade dowry, which all farmers' daughters or brides would make themselves. World War II was now officially over. The Russians celebrated every day. They went on a shopping spree by plundering and stealing everything in sight. Some of them had never seen wristwatches before. Now they wore several on each arm, stopping people and saying, "Urek, Urek." They wanted to take away everyone's wristwatch, or ur, as well as jewelry and in some cases wedding bands. The Russians made an escaped convict from the ball and chain gang the mayor of our town. The latter still wore the uniform when he came to town. He became the #1 communist. We were required to work on the huge estate, which became now a communist-run farm. There were 22 teams of horses, each team having 3 horses and pulling a 2-furrow walk-behind type plow, and another 30 teams of brown-spotted oxen, each team consisting of 2 oxen, pulling the same type of 2-furrow plow. My brother Klaus and I were given each a team of oxen, and we walked barefoot behind the plows in May. In return, we got very little food in the community kitchen, where you had to watch your food on a large shared wood-fired grill or stove, or it would take on a disappearing act. So much for communal cooking. To make things worse, the women folks had to hide each night from the Russian predators. Our second-hand car trek began shortly after World War II had ended. We were lucky enough to acquisition a horse. It was blind, but we could lead it. We took an iron-rimmed wooden-wheeled wagon from the estate that was meant for a team of 2 horses and made a makeshift tongue to pull it. We shared the wagon with another family who had more grown-ups. Our trip lasted only for 13 kilometers when the horse was taken from us by our famous overlords. We divided the wagon, and it became our lot to tie our belongings onto the rear axle assembly. The stronger family took the front part with the tongue on it. Lucky for us, we found out that the taller rear wheels were easier to pull in the long run. We decided to take a different route because there was no ship service across the islands. This is where we saw some of the greatest calamities. I witnessed the mass rape of innocent children and women animal on all 4 limbs, while these subhuman species took turns in mass rape, just 20 feet away from us. My cousins were mass raped by Russian soldiers, then locked up in their own barn and burned to death after the foul deed. These farmers paid a horrible price just as bystanders for something that they had no part of, especially the very young. Another occasion when my family and I were sleeping in a room that we shared with a young woman and her 2 small children, Russian soldiers came into the room, and one of them pushed the 2 little children to one side of the bed and raped this young woman just approximately 10 feet away from us. Some heroes they were. I remember some fleeing farmers trying to hide their wives and daughters under their baggage and bags of oats in their horse-drawn farm wagons. They were either shot to death or beaten to their knees while trying to defend their women folks from mass rape. I recall the Soviets pressing their drum-type machine pistols against the chest of these old family men, yelling "Stoy" and some other words I won't mention. They were held at bay at the threat of death, whereas some were actually shot to death. One woman resisted vigorously until a Soviet soldier shot off the thumb of her baby.